An insect's exoskeleton is sort of like our skin, structured into many layers that increase in hardness the further out you go. It's divided into epidermis and cuticle, which itself is split into several smaller layers. It is mostly made up of a polysaccharide known as chitin, and usually contains a structural protein known as skeleton in addition to it. Basically, chitin on its own behaves similarly to plastic, being rather flexible and pliable. But if skeleton is added to it, the cuticle becomes tougher and heavier. Not just that, skeleton can also slightly change the color of the exoskeleton, making it more dark and brownish in those select areas. Different body parts serve different purposes, and thus contain different amounts of skeleton based on their need. To make it easier for you, here's some examples. Wings are almost entirely made of chitin, as they require a certain amount of flexibility both to flap in the air but also fold back together when not in use. The flagella of some insects' feelers can also be on the softer side for better sensory detection and, of course, so they don't snap off on accident. And obviously, caterpillars and other grubs are as squishy as they are because they have pretty much no skeleton in them. On the other hand, things like mouth parts, legs, horns, and elytra, body parts that experience the most pressure and need to keep up their shape more, are made to be the hardest. As I said, you can often tell what parts of the exoskeleton are harder based on how dark or brown they look, though it's not a perfect rule. A white beetle, for example, can still have a pretty tough exoskeleton despite not having any brown parts, and the dark spots on a ladybug aren't necessarily harder than the rest, just because they're darker. In those cases, it's more of a matter of melanin production and coloration than anything related to skeleton. Some more functions of an insect's exoskeleton include things like sensory hairs, glandular cells that produce repellents or pheromones, a wax layer that helps keep water inside and foreign matter outside, as well as a layer of cement to protect said wax. Some arthropods might even use minerals or other materials to further strengthen their cuticles. The cuticle is also where an arthropod's muscles are attached to, and even the spiracles, which is how they get oxygen, are located here. All of this is to say that exoskeletons are very intricately structured, and I only really scratched the surface of the whole topic. But with that out of the way, I can now start going over the As I just mentioned, an insect's muscles are attached to its cuticle. To be exact, they are hooked onto several folds located on the inside of the exoskeleton that look like pits and ridges on the outside. The big advantage is that they have a much higher internal surface area. In other words, more places for muscles to hook onto. When you compare that to a human arm, where muscles can only really attach to a few select places at the ends of our bones, you realize that insects get a lot more bang for their buck. Here's a side-by-side comparison using rubber bands. This superior muscle leverage is also part of the reason why ants are able to lift things up to 50 times their own body weight. Another advantage is that exoskeletons give insects a lot of ways to combat dehydration. Because of their shape and small stature, they are actually way more affected by the sun. Normally, something like an insect wouldn't be able to survive in a hostile environment like a desert, yet some species still do, and there's a few reasons for that. One of which are the wax and cement layers that I mentioned earlier, but that only prevents part of the issue. The biggest culprit of water loss in insects is actually the spiracles they use to breathe, because they also function as a direct way for water to evaporate. While they can't keep these openings shut forever, they still need oxygen somehow. They can get away with closing them temporarily. Just imagine you could choose not to sweat. On top of that, there's several more methods insects use to avoid the sun, like staying in the shade or using their wings like a poncho. Overall, making them a lot more suited for desert environments than us. And I guess now might be the time to address the elephant in the room. Exoskeletons may look cool and they have a bunch of neat little features, but by far the biggest advantage they provide are, of course, their defensive perks. It takes no genius to realize that if you have a hard outer shell surrounding almost every part of your body, that you're going to be a lot more resilient to things like cuts, stabs, scratches, blunt force, stress, and even pressure. Imagine I did it without a shell. did not work out. But the advantage in this is not just that insects are better protected against predators, it's more so the fact that in order to get to all their vital organs, you first have to make your way through this protective wall. Sure, humans have a skull and a ribcage, but there are still plenty of important areas on our bodies left completely exposed. That's probably the main reason we invented armor, which is basically just an artificial exoskeleton with all of its advantages and disadvantages. Right, I forgot about those. Continuing with the armor analogy, one of the main disadvantages of wearing it is that it both restricts your movement and is incredibly heavy. In the case of insects, this is the downside of having a lot of skeleton in your exoskeleton. It makes you more like a tank in pretty much every way. Because skeleton hardens the cuticle, an insect's body, specifically its limbs, simply cannot bend without snapping. So to compensate, their legs and most other body parts are already snapped from the get-go into various segments. That's how arthropods got their name. And although it's better than nothing, those connecting bits do create major weak points in the otherwise well-defended shell. The increase in weight also directly affects movement, but it's an issue that for the most part only affects beetles, as they have the most sclerotized cuticles in the insect world. Not only does this make it harder for them to climb up to a higher elevation, it also really hinders their ability to use their wings. There's a direct trade-off you have to make. Either you protect yourself and become incapable of turning yourself upright again, or you stay agile on your feet or in the air, but become an easy target for those that want to eat you. But what if I told you that at select times you don't even have any of the benefits? I want you to ask yourself, throughout your life, have you ever gotten bigger in any way? Okay, and follow-up question, as you've grown bigger, did your skin rip apart like paper? I'm guessing not, because human skin grows together with the body. This, however, could not be the case for arthropods, whose hardened exoskeletons are unable to stretch, meaning if an insect wants to grow bigger, it has to break its own shell. This process is known as molting, and it is easily the biggest disadvantage of having an exoskeleton. In order to explain and demonstrate how it works and why it's such a big deal, I'm going to use an apple. Before an insect is able to molt, it has to already have separated its current cuticle from the epidermis, as well as prepared a new cuticle underneath the current one. Once it's ready, it must now look for a place where it can be undisturbed for the next few hours. To break through their exoskeleton, they pump themselves up with air and slowly but surely squeeze their way out. It's a bit like taking off a latex glove that's sticking to your fingers. For the last step, the insect now has to stay idle for anywhere from a few minutes to a couple of hours. That's because the new cuticle is still soft, as it doesn't contain any skeleton yet. The process of sclerotization happens on its own, with the cuticle slowly getting more brown, the same way an apple does. Molting is not difficult, but it does leave the insect incredibly vulnerable. Hopefully it shows a good hiding spot, because otherwise, being left completely defenseless for hours on end doesn't sound that appealing to me, and a lot of insects would agree, which is why the vast majority of them simply stop growing after reaching their adult phase, aka metamorphosis. Some insects and most other arthropods do it anyway, not just to get bigger, but also because it allows for parts of the body to regenerate, one mold at a time. Whether or not this makes the whole process worth it, I'm not really sure. I guess you could ask that about exoskeletons as a whole. Would you wear a full suit of armor that weighs like 80 pounds and doesn't let you scratch your back for the rest of your life? I don't know. If it looks cool, probably.